Can we please take our seats? We're getting ready to start our conversation with our founder and president, Reverend Al Sharpton. Please take your seats.
May we have everybody seated. We're going to start. Shh. I'm going to bring Kirsten to open up this conversation. Let me thank all of you. Now, after we do this conversation, then we hear Dr. Dyson, then the youth are doing their hackathon, and tonight is the dinner. And all of y'all got your tickets for the dinner? Oh. Well, we stop at the desk, make sure. Shh. Tomorrow morning, starting on time, Education Secretary Duncan, we're going to deal with education. We're going to deal with the youth. We have several all day. And then Saturday morning is our regular Saturday rally down here. And Cornell Brooks, head of NAACP, Mark Morial, head of Urban League, Wade Henderson, all of our allies are going to be doing the Saturday morning rally, and we're going to Mrs. Abernathy and others, the veterans of 50 years ago. So it's going to be a lot. We're going to get started. I'm not waiting on the disintegration panel. Youth Day, Mary Pat. How many of y'all know our youth leader? Stand up, Mary Pat. Mary Pat is 17 years old, on her way to Spelman. She was 11 years old when she started with us. She's now National Youth Director, building youth chapters everywhere, real chapters, and real work. Proud of her. Brought all her delegates in around the country. She won, this young lady won the Woman's Award yesterday, the big woman's lunch. Well, tell them I said you won again. One of the things that I'm very proud of is that we're building generation to generation. When I ran for mayor of New York in '97, I met a young man who was president of the Black Student Union at Brooklyn College, where I went, and he joined NAN. He's been with us ever since. He is now the regional vice president. He builds the chapters and coordinates them all over the Northeast. He's going to intro this panel. Yesterday, when we did Children of the Movement, Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, the daughter and son of Ralph Abernathy, the daughter of Malcolm X, and the daughter of Reverend James Orange. That, to me, was a historic panel. And today, like it, because one of the things we're trying to do is make sure you understand the context that we operate from. To have organizations and movements that think it all started with them and ends with them is not only untrue, it makes the movements unstable. We operate in a context, and that's why we did Children of the Movement. That's why we're so honored to do what we're getting ready to do now. Because I want everybody in National Action Network to understand the context we're in. Long after we're all gone, and long after our contributions is over, you will want to be a part of something bigger than you. and something bigger than you started before you and will go after you. And when you're younger and arrogant, you want it all to be about you. But at some point, you understand that if you're part of something bigger than you, it'll make you bigger than you could have ever been by yourself. And that's why we did that yesterday, and that's why we're doing this today. We want to have a sense of history. A lot of young folk get a sense of just them. How do I know it? Because I did it when I was younger. So I tell them, you just tripping. How do I know? Because I used to trip. I talk about everybody with gray hair till mine start turning gray. Talk about the old guard till I start getting older. You're supposed to say you ain't that old, Reverend. You're supposed to learn how to flatter old folks. So I'm proud of this young man, our Regional Vice President of Northeast, Kirsten John Ford.
Thank you, Reverend Sharpton. Praise the Lord, everyone. Greetings, and I'd like to welcome all of you, indeed, to this historic conversation, to the 24th annual convention of the National Action Network. We have been here for 24 years strong. We intend to be here 24 plus 24 plus 24 more. We have arrived at an appointed moment in the civil and human rights movement. From we shall overcome to keep hope alive to no justice, no peace, the continuum of the King mantle of leadership has spanned almost 6 decades. I've had the privilege of personally being mentored by Reverend Al Sharpton, who is undoubtedly today's steward of the King leadership mantle. Even more significant is that I've had the distinct honor of observing the continual mentorship of my mentor's mentor, the first steward of the King leadership mantle, the Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson. There's a passage in the Bible in Mark 10 where John and James, the son of Zebedee, said to the Lord, "Lord, we'd like to be seated both on your right and your left hand." And the Lord replies by saying, "Can you drink of the cup that I have drink of, and can you be baptized with the baptism that I will be baptized with?" And the Lord eventually says, "Those stations are for those for whom they were prepared." This indeed is a special cup and baptism that our leaders must partake of. Leadership is not a smooth road, it's not a grateful road, it's not a forgiving road. It is indeed a lonely road, ripe with castigation, ridicule, and persecution. All three of these men, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson, and Reverend Al Charles Sharpton, have stood in the line of fire to shield us from the brutal onslaught of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, violence, and economic oppression. Reverend Jesse Jackson knew the road less traveled because he was mentored by the one that blazed the trail. Reverend Sharpton knew the road less traveled because he was mentored by the one who paved the road. The King mantle has been their portion because it is the station for which they have been prepared. And now there are those of us who are learning the road less traveled because we are being mentored by the one who illuminated the road with his brilliant light, Reverend Al Sharpton. The question before us isn't just how far has this mantle advanced us as a people or a nation, as individuals, but how far it has protected us from sliding backwards. Intergenerational progress is predicated on continuity. It's predicated on learning and intergenerational cooperation and mentorship. As Reverend Jesse Jackson mentored Reverend Sharpton from the age of 13, Reverend Sharpton is mentoring others like Mary Pat Hector from the age of 11, all the way up the generational ladder to an elder like me, who began at the age of 20 and now at my ripe old age of 39. Today we have a unique opportunity to engage history in our day, in real time. Let us both appreciate this moment and show our appreciation for these anointed men of God, both preachers of soul salvation and anointed prophets of social liberation, the two bearers of the King Mantle of Leadership, Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson and Reverend Alfred Charles Sharpton. Let us start this conversation by asking you, Reverend Jackson, to recall the time that you met Reverend Sharpton and what struck you. Yes, please. What struck you about him that made you recognize his leadership potential? And then, Reverend Sharpton, what made you gravitate towards Reverend Jackson as a leader and a role model for you personally and politically? Thank you.
Good afternoon. It was so long ago I have memory problems. You know, you go to a given class with your classmates and you begin to identify early on he or she is going to go somewhere or the other. You begin to early on detect. And I remember that most of the youth around Al's age, he was about 12, wanted to be like Connie Hawkins, a great basketball player, legend, or Earl of Pearl, or Clyde Frazier. Al wanted to be like Adam Powell, a powerful preacher with a social justice gospel. He was very close to, at that time, to Reverend William Augustus Jones, a powerful preacher and social justice advocate, and Reverend Gardner Taylor State right down the street, and Bishop Washington, whose church he came from, and Reverend Sandy Ray. He wanted to be like these giant preachers. He wanted them to have the edge, however, of the King's social justice dimension. He wanted to be like them. Now he's one of them, perhaps taller than most of them because of the risks he has taken and the reward God has given him with his gifts. I remember so well that I first escorted him to jail. He was around 13 years old. Went to jail fighting the ANP. He was in the lineage of our struggle. He grew up in it. We didn't just see him on TV one night. He didn't happen. He came bottom up, not top down. As we worked together across the country, and he spent time with James Brown exploring the dimensions beyond the church of where our movement had to go. I always believed that so much of our movement for social justice was not confined to the church. The people of conscience was beyond that. And that tradition, we used to have expo, and I was a part of that grand exposition. And I remember so well when he began to fight and became our field director for the Rainbow. And just kind of watch, and it's a joy to watch him grow and learn and live with a unique sense. One day we named the House of Justice the House of Justice. I was privileged to be named the House of Justice. We met on Saturday morning in Chicago, we meet on Saturday morning here in New York. We're really blood of blood, flesh of flesh, spirit of spirit. And oftentimes you'll see him march to the beat of a different drum. It is that leaders at their best don't just follow opinion polls. They mold opinion. They're not just thermometers measuring the temperature. They're thermostats that help control the temperature. Al is a thermostat. He is fundamentally a freedom fighter, deep in the roots of gospel preaching. I have the best of the cultural tradition of gospel preaching with the social justice dimension. It makes him unique among young preachers in the world today. And now he has the platform that none of us ever had before, the MSNBC platform. And the daily radio show. If James Brown was the hardest working man in show business, he's the hardest working man in civil rights. And by far, what's unique about him, the bigger he gets, the smaller he gets.
Let me say this, because I want to answer your question, but then I want to expand it. One, there are many people that hold the mantle of Dr. King. We're just the most visible. But let me say this. When I was 12 and I was in Church of God in Christ, I became attracted to Adam Clayton Powell, which really became a sensitivity to my calling of social justice. And I used to get by the TV and watch him on the news. I finally convinced my mother to let me go to his church, and I met him. And a year later, he was defeated in the primary, and he retired to Bimini. I kind of wanted to stay in social justice. My bishop in Church of God in Christ, Bishop Washington, was not all for it, but not all against it. Most of Kojic, and I know some of y'all are Kojic now, but I'm talking about Kojic then, felt you had backslid if you got involved in politics. And you couldn't get involved in that. My pastor said, well, if he's going to get in that, let him work with preachers, so at least he stays in the church. And he brought me to Reverend Jones and asked them to look out for me. I thought that they were stale preachers because they didn't hoop and holler like us. How come we used to hoop, holler, roll under sheets, tarry all night long? So I drifted in and out at 12 and 13. And one night, Dr. King was killed, who I had met twice at Washington Temple. They used to have the big rallies there because the size of Washington Temple could hold it. But I was not one that knew him. I just met him. And when he died and my mother was crying so hysterically, I asked her, why are you crying like he was a member of our family? And she said, you would have had to grow up in Alabama like I did. I was born and raised in Brooklyn. And sit on the back of a bus or be thirsty and couldn't drink out the water fountain to understand who Dr. King really was. We went to a movie theater not far from where I grew up in Brownsville. Lowe's Kings is now back open for performing arts. And saw a movie called From Montgomery to Memphis. In the end of the movie, Nina Simone sung the song, What Do We Do Now the King of Love is Dead? And I felt like she sang it to me. And I went back to Breadbasket that Saturday and been involved ever since. 69, we opened the Breadbasket office on Fulton Street. I was 13. And I met, Reverend Jones introduced me to a man I had seen but had not known. Thing that attracted me was he never wore a suit and tie. He wasn't stale like the older preachers. Had a big afro, wore a buckskin vest, had a big medallion. Reverend Jesse Jackson. He used to do that too. In fact, he had another medallion with Carlos and them with the fist up. And I immediately fell in love with Reverend Jackson. He was the second idol to me to Adam Clayton Powell. Same flair, same kind of charisma, but was hard on me because he used to, I would imitate the flair, but he would tell me, you got to read, you got to study. He said, you can't be up there like a parakeet, just bah, 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 and don't know nothing. And I used to tell my mother, he's hard on me. Got me reading books that I don't understand. Howard Thurman didn't make sense to me. And it started a long relationship. And many of the things I used to get angry at him about, trying to make me do, as I grew older, I learned that leadership is more about what you know than what you show. And Reverend Jackson was, from then and is now, my leader and mentor, and still is. Now, I don't want us talking about this like, one thing we get into wrongly in generations, act like generations retire because you come of age. They just continue to serve at a more expanded level. What he's doing in Silicon Valley today is the only one doing that. So when you're talking about yesteryear, I'll give you this. When Ferguson happened, many of you in there said this is what we've been talking about for 20 years with police brutality. Then now, Charleston has happened. We're saying the same thing. Well, the reason I took it with some balance is that when Obama happened, that stuff he did for 20 years. Sometimes you can get bitter and say people forget that we've been doing this all along and now they're at the celebration. But you learn to be grateful that you live long enough to see people realize what you do. We ought to be proud that we didn't just get into police abuse. But he has to be proud every time President Obama walks out that White House, because the victory of the race was won in '84 when Jackson cracked open Iowa. When he ran, many of the black politicians, including the civil rights establishment, would not support him, thought it was crazy. And he got 3.5 million votes, came back and did double that in '88. The economic reciprocity, we just had David Korn and all of them up here from the corporation. He started that way back, breadbasket. His assignment from Dr. King was economics. Percy Sutton, who was like a godfather to him and later to me, Percy Sutton, for whatever reason, when I was a teenager, sponsored me and my mother to go to Black Expo. Dwight McKee, who was here. First time I saw him, Reverend Jackson had him give Roy Wilkins an award at Black Expo. And Reverend Jackson gave Roy Wilkins his medallion. And I said, I don't understand that, because to us, I grew up now in New York, we were a little more militant. And we thought Roy Wilkins was not militant. I would say what we used to call him, but I don't want the young folk to know I used to talk like they talk now. And but I came to understand that we all don't have to do what we do the same way. And I understood Reverend Jackson giving Roy Wilkins an award, even though Roy Wilkins didn't do what we did, because they're different lanes on the same highway. Only time we have an accident is if you start switching lanes without a signal that you're about to change lanes. Jesse Jackson remains the person that I modeled. Saturday morning rallies, all of that, I learned from him. There is no taking away from you to have role models and give them credit. It takes away from you when you don't embrace how you get where you got. Last point, then I want to get out of all this nostalgia, because I don't want this to turn into that kind of session. But the last point is, he mentioned MSNBC. Guy asked me the other day, what do I think about when I'm going in 30 Rockefeller Center every night, which I'm going to do about an hour. Something that a lot of you may not remember. I see Chi-Chi Williams in the back, who heads the Wall Street Project here for Reverend Jackson. I first met Chi-Chi when she was one of the anchors here at WABC TV. And we used to do stuff trying to get Chi-Chi to put us on the news. I used to call Chi-Chi and say, this is Reverend Sharpton's press secretary, Charlene. I was my own press secretary. I was my own advance man. I was my own bodyguard, all one person. I had about 4 different voices down. I could work a payphone real good. And Chi-Chi acted like she thought she talked to press. She knew it was me because I couldn't. She said, yes, Charlene. What does Reverend Sharpton have today? Well, we've got 3,000 kids getting ready to do so-and-so. She says, all right, and she come about 10 kids doing something. But we told her the other 2,900 had gone to lunch. But she put it on TV anyway. But The one thing I think about, and I thought about it when Kiss was talking about preparation, what a lot of y'all don't remember, for 9 years, 10 years, Reverend Jackson had a show on CNN called Both Sides with Jesse Jackson. In the 90s, I would go to Washington. As he said, I was heading up the Ministers Division for Rainbow. And he would go to CNN to do his show. He'd take me with him. And I remember walking in CNN every week with him when I was in Washington. And he'd show his badge, you go up. I'd have to get a visitor's pass. And I think about that now when I walk at NBC and they have to get a visitor's pass to go with me. So we went from a weekly show to a daily show, and one of y'all gonna do something I ain't doing, but it's the same message, same ocean. We just running our lap. There ain't no conflict. It's a continuity. And the only way you're valid is if something behind you continues the validation. Otherwise, what you're doing wasn't important. I'm glad when Reverend Jackson said he wanted to come to the convention to do a conversation, I'm glad that he came like I was tonight. He named the House of Justice, because National Action Network is a branch of his ministry and a continuation of what he taught us. And we should not, we're great. On tomorrow, they're going to have Dr. Ben's funeral. And on Monday, Gardner Taylor's funeral. We are great at great funerals. But we ought not wait for people to pass to give the credit that we wish we had said. He needs to know when we meet that it's just another meeting from what he started, because he had not put that in me as a teenager and others, many of whom will not admit it, then we would not have blossomed and done what we done. Don't mean you don't have disagreements. Don't mean we don't argue. You argue with your daddy and your mama. You argue with your sisters and your brothers. My father was gone for many years. Then when he came back in my life, I wouldn't speak to him, mad about him gone, which is crazy. You mad somebody's gone, when they show up, you still ain't speaking. I was in Florida, and I'm going to get back to Reverend Jackson, doing Trayvon Martin. My mother had gotten Alzheimer's and dementia for 8 years. One night my sister called and said, you should come see her. I didn't have to speak to my sister. Many of y'all know the background of my sister and my father. And I said, I'll get there. Then I got on a plane a week later. I was getting the car on the way to the airport, and I saw a message that come at about midnight from my sister. While I was in the car, I listened to the message. She said my mother had passed. I started to turn around and go home, and I said, no, my mother would have wanted me to go. I got on the plane anyway. Governor David Patterson was on the plane with me, and we flew on to Sanford, Florida. First big rally on Trayvon Martin. And when we landed, David said, I'm looking at the internet, your mother died? I said, yeah, I didn't even tell him. And a week later, we came back for the second rally. Reverend Jackson came. Reverend Jackson and I flew. Lamel McMorris flew us over to Dothan. My mother's funeral was going to be the next day. Reverend Jackson walked me to my mother's casket that night. Just me and him and Lamel in the funeral home. Viewed my mother. And I thought about how much my mother always loved Reverend Jackson. When she was sick with Alzheimer's, and I would go down and see her, she didn't know me. And I would tell all kind of stories couldn't break through the Alzheimer's. One day, Reverend Jackson was preaching in Dothan, and he called me and said, where's your mother in Dothan? I said, the nursing home was so-and-so. He went to the nursing home, and the doctor said, well, you don't have a permission to see her, but let's see if we can get a relative on the phone to authorize Reverend Jackson. Everybody's all excited. Jesse Jackson's at the nursing home. And he's standing out there waiting on authorization. So the doctor went in and said, Miss Sharpton, and she looked up, says, we're trying to get clearance. We have somebody I want to see you, Reverend Jesse Jackson. She said, oh, I know him. He's a friend of mine. And he never let me forget that she remembered him and she didn't know me. But that's the kind of family that we've been. Now, having said all of that, we are in a technological age. Our young folk don't read newspapers. They read the internet. We get up in the morning seeing this morning the convention in the paper. They get up and get it Google, Yahoo, and a bunch of other sites. And some sites that we are not supposed to be looking at. But that's how they get their news. And they communicate with email and other techniques. Where Dominique and Ashley? Ashley will tell me she was at service last night. She taught me the internet now and technology, Chichi. I said, really? She said, yes. You was at church late, huh? Yeah, I tried to call you. You wasn't answering your phone. She said, no, we was at service last night. I said, it was interesting because somebody on Instagram looked just like you was at the club last night. So they upset that they taught me technology now. So they try to block me off Instagram, but I got them. Mary Pat taught me how to do the unblock. They block me, I unblock me. The only one that has looked at the billions of dollars and trade and contracts in technology, which is where the country's going, is what Reverend Jackson's doing with the Silicon Valley work. We cannot, Dr. King said we can't integrate into a burning house. We cannot get diversity into a business model that's going out of business. The business model that is going into the future is the technology business. And that's where his focus has been. So people talking about what are you doing out there in Silicon Valley, because the world has been siliconized. And you still trying to get an A&P, and they closed. If we cannot deal with diversity at Apple and Yahoo and others, we will be a large percentage of something that is going out of business. So what I want Nan to do is to be supportive of the Silicon Valley movement, and I wish Reverend Jackson would expound upon his work in Silicon Valley and give us his analysis of where we are going politically. In this context, when we leave here Saturday, we are already in the 2016 season. We've already seen Cruz has announced, Rand Paul has announced. It's already started. Whoever wins will be the first person to preside after the first black president. I want y'all to hear me good. Whoever wins, Republican or Democrat, we've never before been at this place in history, because emotionally, blacks have never been where we had a white successor to a black president. A lot of us has gotten used to the symbols of that. Our children have gotten used to a black first family. It is going to be a real psychic drop in about 18 months. And what we didn't get in substance, we're going to feel like a rush of cold air. A lot of y'all run outside this morning, it's April, and the winter hits you. That's how it's going to hit you in 18 months. What do we do in these 18 months, Reverend Jackson, that prepares us for this emotional drop that we put substance in front of whoever comes? I want him to give us the Silicon Valley and the political analysis, because we're going to go through some serious withdrawal in a little while, because we won't even feel like we in whether we really been in or not, we at least feel that way. You know, it's like when I was in school, I was a little fat boy smiling and a fine girl, and she smiled back. Never dated me, but she smiled, so I felt I had a shot. So, you know, Obama smiling at us, we feel we got a shot. We ain't even gonna feel like we got a shot in 18 months. How we deal with all of that, I want Reverend Jackson to give us that counsel. I want us to leave here ready to go to work to help him in Silicon and ready to deal with the political climate that we about to face. If Charleston happened 18 months after now, it would have been a different kind of reaction. But when the Novocaine wear off and the pain hits you, what we gonna do then? We better prepare now. Reverend Jackson.
Only Al can preach a question. I see our struggle in stages with very defined dates. Unlike immigrants or refugees or nationalized citizens, we came enslaved. It's unique among the makeup of the American family. 246 years, that was not a season, it was 2.5 centuries of being a commodity more valuable than banks, land, or insurance. 246. The prosperity of the cotton industry was of such, it made us necessary to that industry. It was not so much north and south because the cotton kingdom was Montgomery, Alabama. The trading port was New York. And that's why you have the graveyards on Wall Street today of our forefathers and foremothers calling out to us. Watch this. Civil War came. We were freed to join the Union Army and did so and helped to win the battles. And while there was not much reluctance to us joining the fight, there was a lot of reluctance to us being freed, even by the Northerners, because they too prospered from the slave industry. But it passed by a few votes. Watch this. 1870, the big mistake made was they put the slave masters in charge of overseeing the liberation. They put the slave masters in charge of the voting rights, health and education and labor. The slave master in charge of voting, health, education, and labor. The result is that we had the right to vote for 95 years, was held up to 1965. It's interesting season in there because we jumped from 1865, Dyson, to 1896 when the Supreme Court ruled backwards. What's missed in this equation is 1870 to 1950, there were 4,000 plus blacks lynched. The politics of lynching, the politics of terror. You started lynching with Emmett Till, you missed a lot. You started with our struggle in 1954 with Thurgood Marshall, you missed a lot. I say 246 years of slavery and then another 70 years of lynching where most blacks were killed after church on Sunday. Most lynching parties, women in their bonnets and men in their suits. I say 4,000. Many blacks came north not looking for jobs. They came here and got rejected and put in ghettos. They came north as refugees. And so it makes me feel anxious to think about the 54, 64, 65 heroes. I went to jail in 1960 and all that, and John got beat in 1965. We got beat on bridges, but they got lynched. Whole families got lynched. Got burned alive. And it wasn't on the internet. Wasn't on television. Wasn't on radio. And hardly recorded in the paper. There's now a guy named Brian Stevenson who simply wants a marker put wherever a lynching took place. There's not rebellion against that because that is the dark season we don't want the lights on. that between 1870 and 1950 was a very dark season of lynching as a terror, as a form, whatever ISIS is doing. We did more of it. A dark season of lynching where, I'm not talking about those who went to court and were sentenced to death, them those who were outside. When I was 7 years old, a guy named Willie Earl was arrested, accused of looking at a white woman. He was mentally retarded. They took him out of jail, severed his head, put his head in the garbage can, put his body down the street. I'm saying that to say there's a travail here, a travel, a road that is very different than other history. We have to know it to have. If you don't know this, you don't have bass in your music. It's all treble. There's no depth in your stuff. You sympathize, you don't empathize. So we leap fast forward the 4 stages in the movement, as I see it. If stage 1 was to end legal slavery, 246 years. Stage 2, end Jim Crow, 58 years from 1896 to 1954. Phase 3 was the access to the right to vote. But you can be out of slavery, out of Jim Crow, have the right to vote, and starve to death. Every homeless person is out of slavery, out of Jim Crow, but say without access to capital, industry, technology, deal flow, and relationships, the freedom without equality seems to be in vain. Every time a transition was made, Al, those who were in charge of oppression kept the infrastructure. 246 years of slavery said, well, all right, y'all free. We free, but we still control the banks, the highways, education, hospitals, labor. There never was a turning over of infrastructure or repair or reparation for damage done. If you don't believe in reparation, you believe in ethnic cleansing. If you don't believe in reparation, you do believe in ethnic cleansing. Well, 246 years matter. Then we get freedom. Then we get the vote with the slave master, who now, there are always more slaves than slave masters. Now they got to accept the vote of the slave. They were extremely resentful. The slave master resentful, and the other white indigents use us as target practice to get a sense of self-esteem. So stage 1, in slavery. Stage 2, in Jim Crow. Stage 3, right to vote. Stage 4, access to capital, industry, technology, and deal flow. Thus, as free as, but why don't we own a single downtown building in New York, or Philadelphia, or Washington, or Atlanta, or Memphis? We got free in stages, but never equal in stages. Now follow me on this here. So here we are today. We made certain moves driven by tailwinds. I was pained by Selma celebration, because it was a celebration and not a demonstration. 1965, what was different was we got the troops restored. So long as the troops were in place from 1865 to 1877, we were beginning to get Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was protected by troops. When the troops left, Reconstruction left, and terrorists set in. So what was different about the 65 Voting Rights Act was Section 4 and Section 5 gave us protection. You could not remove boundaries unless you got government, federal government clearance. Watch this. So while August 6, 1965 is we're celebrating, June 25th, 2013, they took away the troops again. That's why every southern state from Virginia around to Texas is going Confederate again, because they've drawn us out. We get elected, but in the back of the seat of the legislative process. So long as they can use gerrymandering, annexation, at-large, and roll purging, then our votes is diminished. It's not stopped, it's diminished. So it's like a half a vote or something. It's not the real vote. So in Selma, Dr. King said, well, the right to vote is not enough. Let's have poor people's campaign. In Selma, we didn't mention that the Voting Rights Act of 65 we were celebrating was there 2 years. Every southern state is controlled by Confederates again. Every southern governor rejects Medicaid. Alabama, the governor standing on the platform with a sense of a flash of decency on that stage, he turned down $10 billion in Medicaid. He accepted a $120 million grant for education but spent on prison reform. And he's sitting on the stage on Voting Rights Day. It should have been, well, he should have been, not that. Because he supports Shelby, not Selma. Shelby is anti-Selma. Say Shelby. Removing the troops is anti-Selma. So we lost Shelby. We lost Selma. Every legislature now that's on this deal now, say rules matter. There's a runoff in Chicago this past week between Troy and Emmanuel. Watch this. Why was that runoff? Because when Harold Washington won in '83, in a three-person race, they said, there'll never be another Negro to get in three-person race. They changed the rules. You have to have 50 plus 1. That's why that was a runoff. The rule set for Harold Washington trapped them. Watch, say rules. In '84, I got all these new voters. Only 4 of the delegates said, what's going on here? Well, what was going on was, at that winner take all. If I get 48.6 and you get 50.1, you get a whole 100. That's strange math. So we challenged that. And we won in '88. This is what I just give Jesse Summer because he was working real hard. In '88, in '08, when President Obama ran, Hillary Clinton won California, Ohio, Texas, and Pennsylvania. On the 84 rules, she would have been the winner. President Barack would not have gotten a California or a Texas or an Ohio or a Pennsylvania delegate. We changed, so we democratized the rules. Our whole struggle has continuity. All of it matters. All I'm trying to do now at this 10 age, Al has more energy and more platform. It's exciting. I enjoy watching little people grow. When I look at Al and look at Jesse and look at Jonathan and look at Cynthia, my heart rejoices in watching their growth. This is growth you're looking at here. Let's go a step further. Because what it means is that we're not facing a headwind. In the 6 weeks we were down, but we've been pushed by tailwind. Going to jail was exciting. Marching was exciting. And we didn't mind going. But now what we want is being taken away. Question is, are we fighting hard enough to keep it? That is a big question. When Ferguson has 80% black voters and have 6% turnout and celebrating the King holiday, something is missing. When Chicago has 700,000 registered blacks, the Mill wins with 350,000. Something is missing. So I remain agonized with the fact that while we talked about how we won in '65, Dr. King said we got to deal with poverty. Miss Boynton, she is to Selma what Rosa Parks was to Montgomery. Her house is now condemned. Down the street from where she lives, the houses now don't have indoor toilets. Dallas County is 40% in poverty. And so if we are in the King legacy, we must protect the vote on the attack and affirm poverty as the weapon of mass destruction. You can't have a big rally in Selma, don't have it. Here's what Selma did for us. Well, what did us do for Selma? I wouldn't have been the congressman, I wouldn't have been this, I wouldn't have been Selma good. That's what Selma did. But what did we do for Selma? Selma sits there today with a bridge named after Confederate war general. 40% in poverty, drowning in water. And so that's kind of what we're about. Now, on the Silicon Valley thing, I look up in this stage of our struggle. We got access to education, access to vote, can't get access to capital. That's jumping in a pool without water. You can jump, but sure can't swim. So top 20 companies, 189 board members, 36 white women, 3 blacks, 1 Latino. We challenge them on those numbers. And so they filed a lawsuit. Say they can't tell us information because they have proprietary information. And they won the lawsuit. So we bought shares of stock. Went to shareholders meeting as shareholders, not sharecroppers. I said, Mrs. Meg, 25% of our consumers, 25% of them African American Latino. None of them on our board. Matter of fact, why is it that we're not qualified to serve on boards? What about our EEOC report? I'm shareholder now. I can ask Alva, shifted my tense, you know. Salva. And then I said, but 365 C-suite workers, 3 blacks and 1 woman, and 3 blacks and 1 Latino. Investment in startup companies as almost in zero. So this fight we're having to make EEOC public, EEO1, and they said we can't find blacks. We bring in the congressman on being inundated by bringing in B1 workers from foreign countries. So there's nothing in Silicon Valley. There's nothing in STEM we cannot do. So I said, well, let's hook up with HBCUs. Black engineers are not coming from USC. They're coming from Howard and A&T and Hampton. That's where they're coming from. So now Enron has a Intel, a $300 million deal from Silicon Valley to HBCUs. One part of it is to make the company look like its market by 2020. Another is to create a pipeline from black colleges to Silicon Valley, and thus invest in startups. Now Apple is following the path. That change now to a gender and race comes from the civil rights movement. That is our tradition. Now, if I were on the board, I couldn't do that. If I was on the board, we could be on boards. But it's hard to change that, the bigger structure locked into profiting from the old one. It's hard to be on the bigger structure for the future locked in the old one of the past. So I would appreciate at some point in time the benefits of being on the board. But I can't be on that and be a freedom fighter. And I choose to be a freedom fighter. Thank you.
To wrap this up, we're going to bring on a scholar and a preacher that knows this work. And before we do that, I want you, Reverend Jackson, to give a charge to Nan as our godfather on where we need to leave the convention focusing on. When I was younger and more cocky, I'd say grandfather, but see how I've matured?
Smaller you get, big you get, smaller you get. Every problem does not have the power within it to incite a movement. Good potholes, problem, or this problem. The Loretta Lynch issue is a challenge we should not miss. She's qualified, African-American female. And the way you measure President Obama is not just what he has done, but what he's been prevented from doing also. You do know he came into office, we lost 800,000 jobs that month. We've not had a losing month in these 6 years, not a losing, some higher, some lower. So not 1 month losing jobs. There are people today who never had insurance before, who would have been dead because they couldn't get it, are alive because of Medicaid, because of affordable health care. They choose to call it Obamacare, but there ain't no such bill as Obamacare. Say there is no such bill as Obamacare. There is affordable care. But to call it Obamacare is a way of putting it down. So you got folk in Kentucky saying, I want some of that foldable care stuff because my child can stay on my insurance time 26 and I get real sick at the hospital for the first time. They want foldable, they don't want Obamacare. They want an omelet but don't want the eggs. So anybody that wants the omelet, don't want the eggs, seriously confused. President Obama is today in the Caribbean islands today, had brought Cuba back into the family. It never did make sense to hold. That's a groundbreaker. There's room for criticism. I don't do it publicly for one strategic reason. There's enough of it already. And I do not want what we do to be misinterpreted, what they're inclined to do. So we have, if there are more jobs, say more jobs, more health care, more children in school. Those are steps in the right direction. And my last point is this issue of poverty. That is his remaining challenge. We had a NATO summit in Chicago 2 years ago. All the big nations of the world came. We now need an urban summit the same way. Chicago, on the black side of town, the Latino side of town, 30% unemployment. On the north side, white side of town, 2% unemployment. Suburban job wanted signs. You with me so far? In the city, closed down 50 public schools, 50 drugstores, 75 grocery stores, and all of the trauma units, and all the banks, and all the outlets to banks. We need an urban, and whether that's Bed-Stuy, or Harlem, or whether it is Memphis, or Newark, there is no defined urban policy. I want the president to come to Chicago, hometown, and bring with him HUD, HHS, Labor, Secretary of Commerce, and use a model for here's how to do it. That way you would circumvent the right-wing Congress, because the beauty of what Lyndon Johnson did, and I close on this, Al, is that he knew that the Republicans would, at that point, the Jefferson Davis Democrats would react to war on poverty. He opened up the war on poverty in Appalachia, because there are more white poor than there are black poor. And so he opened up in Appalachia. He deracialized the debate. He say Lyndon Johnson deracialized the debate and whitenized the face of poverty. When John Kennedy went to Harlem Hill with a black baby in his arm, oh, that's what liberals do. It was dismissed. When Robert Kennedy went to Appalachian Hill with a white baby in his arm, that baby's snotty nose, that baby's running water. That face helped redefine the war on poverty. Y'all with me so far? And so now we must now revive the protected right to vote and a war on poverty. If we leave after 8 years with less voter protection and more poverty, it's not a good thing. And that's why we must join forces, whether it's Loretta Lynch, or whether it's fighting this budget. Can you imagine today? It's hard for me to imagine. My father came from World War II, couldn't use the same toilets as Nazi POWs. The day Dr. King gave that speech from Texas around Maryland, we can use a single public toilet. Smoke in the back could be in the parks, but we could not. We could not rent a room at Holiday Inn. We could not buy ice cream at Howard Johnson. We have come a long way for freedom, but not very far for equality. That's why you have so little evidence of economic justice. So we have social justice at the epidemic level. With equal justice, I share. 20,000 auto dealerships, 276 blacks. That's what I'm trying to say. Coke, Pepsi, there's not one black soft drink bottle franchise in the country. I'm talking about equality. I'm not talking about the taste. Am I here by myself? So we are freer and less equal. Do let me say to you, remain close Reverend Sharpton. He's not just his own man, he's an instrument of God. And God, he's a very scarred man, but you get your scars from your scars. Surviving the winters and the crossfires and the attacks is the stuff of which leadership is made. We love Dr. King as a martyr, but not as a martyr. When Dr. King, 2 weeks before he was killed, Dr. King was rated 55% in the negative among blacks. And 72% in the negative among whites. After April 5th, he was everybody's guy. So we love soldiers, but not veterans. We love martyrs, but not martyrs. While he yet lives, has us energy, has us platform, rally to his call. God bless you guys.
Reverend Jesse Jackson. Let me bring on now, a man needs no introduction, a philosopher, preacher, academician who has worked with us in NAN from the beginning and who also has sat at the feet of Reverend Jackson. He now teaches at Georgetown University and preaches all over the world. Reverend Dr. Michael Eric Dyson.
Let the church say amen. Amen. I'm just sandwiched here between two black geniuses, right? One on my right side, a rhetorical master of the first order, a man who cut his teeth in Greenville, South Carolina, and then under the ministry of Martin Luther King Jr., and when he was felled by an assassin's bullet, stood tall and carried us forward under white retrenchment, under the reactionary politics of white supremacy, under black bourgeois captivity to the dominant white supremacist mindset. And then he was a public intellectual arguing our case on television and at Harvard and in the streets. And then he was also raising this young phenom on my left, right? And this man is like Emerson, constant self-redefinition, renegotiation. He ain't what he was because he has become better than we could imagine, right? And so the path was cleared for this gentleman here because of the death of our great leader. Reverend Sharpton steps into the gap without the benefit of the displacement of the genius that preceded him. And so instead of being murdered, he killed his old image. He redefined his body and his mind. And people talk about his hair. I tell Reverend Sharpton, I love that hair. Put him up next to a silhouette of George Washington and see if you can't tell the difference. He took it old school. That's James Brown and the first president of the United States of America. Now, why are we here? Just a couple of minutes. Because both of these men represent the exponential increase in the movement and the struggle to get us free and, as Reverend Jackson said, equal. Ain't no sense in just being free, as Reverend Jackson said, without having the ability to exercise your freedom with economic prerogative. So now the era in which we live is not simply about looking back at Selma and being nostalgic. It's about moving forward. We are now in the era of Black Lives Matter. The first people we got to convince of that is black people. Because Negroes don't believe it either. Because if we believed it, we would affirm all black lives, not some black lives. Some of us want the straight people, not the gay, or the lesbian, or the transgender, the bisexual. Some people want the men and not the women. When we talk about what's going on here, and because of these two gentlemen, we have expanded the vision of the civil rights movement. Reverend Sharpton's valiant and courageous defense of same-sex, same-loving gender people is a remarkable development within the context of the Black Baptist and religious tradition. So we got to stop all the hate from within. I ain't never been to a black church that turned down gay tithes.
Our singers, our musicians.
Or musicians. Or if we're going to be real about it, preachers too. But we ain't got time to break that down. So all black lives matter. And the reason this man is beloved, to my left, among so many black poor people, is because he understood long before most people that the defining issue of our era and epoch would be the vicious assault upon black bodies by white cops and black cops and police. We didn't need to listen to NWA because he was on it before they were. After police coming straight from the underground, a young brother got it bad because I'm brown and not the other color. So police think they have the authority to kill a minority. He was on it before then. He understood it before then. That's why they call him up. He ain't butting his nose into business he ain't supposed to be in. His job as a prophet is to tell the truth across the nation wherever that truth is demanded. This is why, as Reverend Jackson said in his program and plan, not only do black lives matter and gay and black, lesbian black lives matter, but little girls' lives matter. I'm over here with Kimberly Crenshaw on the side over here, Black Genius, the founder of Intersectional Thought. Look it up when you go to the crib and Google her. Critical Race Theory. Now Black Girls Matter. Black girls in New York are 10 times more likely to be expelled from school than white girls in New York City. It ain't just our little boys. It ain't just my brother's keeper. It's my sister's keeper too. And so we need both of those. And finally, this organization is so powerful. Reverend Sharpton has installed as the executive director a female, Janae Ingram, a brilliant and gifted young lady. He wears his feminism in his practice. He opens his vision so that whosoever has talent is able to exercise that talent. And what you and I must do here now is to leverage all of our potential and our genius and our talent and go forward and defend the Walter Scotts of the world. Because Walter Scott, who got killed on tape in South Carolina, is your daddy, your cousin, your brother, your mama, your sister. Walter is you. And so you've got to understand the importance of what that means. That's why I support National Action Network. That's why Reverend Jesse Jackson is my leader. That's why Reverend Al Sharpton is my leader. He can stand in the White House and talk to the first black president, or he can stand on the street corner and speak to a crack addict. I have been with him when he has done both. He never sells out. He never turns his back on the vulnerable, and he continues to uplift us. I was at his mother's funeral when he preached his mama's funeral with a kind of grief, but also a glory. And what I remembered about that service was that this man who had been through so much tragedy, so much trauma, so many trials, had allowed God to transform his life to make him who he is today. So in contribution to his life, his mother gave all she had. And he gave back to her that day the kind of love and sincere devotion that only a son could give. Now you and I must treat black America as the kin that we are. We must learn to love each other beyond color coordination, light versus dark, big versus small, educated versus non-educated. Because guess what? If we ain't going together, ain't none of us going at all. And I'll end by saying this. You got to already be there before you get there. I told the story at his mother's funeral. I was changing planes, going from one city to the other, from Detroit to Chicago. My ticket said I left at 8 o'clock and said I arrived at 7:55. Y'all know what I'm saying. I done already got there before I even left. If you ain't at where you going, you ain't gonna be there when you arrive. And so you've got to plan now for the future, for our little ones, girls and boys, for all of our children, so that the truth that we fight for will be theirs. The equality that we need will be theirs. The freedom that we love and embrace will be theirs. And the justice for which we are hungry will be theirs as well. Thank God for these two men. Thank God for these two men. Thank God for these two men. And thank God for our future in our boys and our girls. God bless you.
Dr. Michael Eric Dyson. I think with all this, we should raise an offering now. Let me ask you to do this before we break this session. This has been a great family reconciliation, and this is historic, but it ought to be naturally done with your family, your mentor, your church. We all have people in our families that have gone through things undeserving or deserving. And we've got to, in that spirit that Dr. Dyson talked about, be their wind beneath their wings. My younger brother, Jesse Jackson Jr., just was released. And he's in halfway house making his transition. It has been a trying thing for him and his family, and for particularly his mother and father, who, as you've seen Reverend Jackson all over the world in these 2 years while Jesse's been incarcerated, has had to make way for his grandchildren. He now comes home. We don't know what he's going to do, but knowing his brilliance, he will do something with great contribution. I want us to take the hand of the person next to us. I want us to have a prayer for Jesse Jr. And as we pray, I want you to think of someone in your own experience that we need to hold up in prayer. We've got to quit beating each other down and start lifting each other up. Maybe God left us up to test to see if we would help those down. Let's quit talking about, oh, so-and-so's in trouble, and start talking about how we can strengthen each other through our troubles. I want Reverend to be able to tell Jesse the convention pause to pray for him and pray for those like him. Reverend, lead us in prayer.
Operative word in this backdrop distinguishes this organization as something called action. Action. When Al goes into a corporate headquarters, he might picket, he might walk, he might negotiate. It's action. Last week when they almost stopped the Big Four, the Final Four, because the gays were offended, blacks are offended every day. And they should have been offended, and there should have been action. But since our boys on the going from cotton balls to basketball, we should be offended too. Say somebody must demand an even playing field for all God's children. Accept our petition, dear God. Search our hearts and know our ways. would all make us better, never better, and more fit for the fight. Spare our lives and keep us humble in thy presence. Give us the power to do a new thing, love one another as you've loved us. The strength to go forward by hope and never backwards by fear. Bless those who hear, those who wish they could be here. Bless the president today in the islands where so many slave ships landed, for being a source of liberation, a source of hope, a source of power. We thank you so much. Our hearts rejoice. Amen.
Next up, everyone, we have the immigration panel and Empire.
The conservative folks by engaging in massive deportations and by agreeing to things that we thought he was giving away the store on border security issue, when none of that worked and they were willing to pocket the deportations and pocket the border security measures and not make the compromise. He actually had no choice but to act, because the system is fundamentally broken and has been fundamentally broken for decades. Not just, even the last reform did not fix the broken nature of the system, and so we have this outrageous situation of a system where we do not know even at this point how many people, not only are undocumented, but how many overstays. I mean, there's no way of tracking. The only community ever that got documented, that was undocumented, was mine. After 9/11, the Special Registration Program required everyone from an Arab or Muslim country and Korea. I think there were 7 Koreans, so it kind of made it a little diverse in that mix. From North Korea, had to go and register. They estimated there were about 160,000 people who had been in this group. Of them, about 80 or so thousand did in fact register, and 13,000 were held for deportation. And what we found in most of those deportation cases that we knew about, that actually came back to us, were that those were folks who, from the Clinton years, had taken advantage of some of the amnesties that had been provided. I'd been married and I went in and filed and said, can I do this? Or I switched my academic program, and they'd get a letter during the Clinton years saying, we know you're here, you know we've overstayed, you filed for a change in status, status change is pending. But after 9/11, those were all canceled out. When they went into report, if they went into Virginia to register, they were told, that's all right, you got the letter, you're okay. If they went to New York or they went to LA, they were told, this isn't good, you're going to be deported. And 13,000 people got swept up that way. So basically, when the whole issue began to evolve, to develop around undocumented, we felt a little bit like, nobody had been out there for us at the time when our folks were all being deported or going undercover, doubly so, or simply going across the border to Canada, because they'd already been wiped out of the system in a shameful program, which actually taught me 2 things. One is how absolutely shameful it was, and 2, how our folks end up standing alone when national security and immigration issue gets conflated. People just turned their backs on us and walked away. And the 3rd thing it taught me was how fundamentally broken the system was. That they didn't know the magnitude of it.